All right, so that was a really perfect uh, lead in actually to what I wanted to discuss here, especially the what Dr. Curry said about identity and about Chestnut not being able to figure out where he belonged in American society. This space that he occupies, a lot of that is foundational to his writing, and that's from his life in Fayetteville, which was relatively brief. He left for Ohio, as Dr. Curry said, not long after he was in his 20s, and it was his journals from 1874 to 1882 that really give us an idea of the author, the man that he was going to become later on in his life. All of those frustrations, the isolation that he feels, not only because of his mixed race, but because of his ambitions. All of those things are so obvious in his journals. And it was his journals that I read first before I read any of his fiction. So it was interesting to meet him as a child, really, and then a younger man, and then to read his fiction after that. And it was at City Center Gallery and Books, actually, probably in 2011, that I bought his journal, not knowing much else about him. And as I read it, I became really curious about these places in Fayetteville that he was visiting, that he would mention in his journal. And so I was like, okay, I wonder where that is now. And it's got far out of hand as far as the work that I started to do. And I will try to share my screen now. Let's see if that works. Are we good? Okay.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So this is a walking tour that I created based on the places that he describes in his journals of Fayetteville. And I'm not going to go over every single stop on the tour, but one important place is George High's bookstore, which is on the market squares, as he calls it in the book. And High would actually go on to own the Fayetteville Observer. He was a white man. And Chesnutt, he never really spent a lot of time at home in his youth, we find out. He was always at the home of his teachers or borrowing books from other people. But George High's bookstore is really interesting because High allowed him to spend a lot of his time there and to debate with him about the issues of race in the South. And High was a strange character because his views on race were by no means progressive, but he seemed to almost enjoy his discussions and debates with Chesnutt. Um, and as I said, it would have been located somewhere uh, where the self-help building is now. But Chesnutt spent a lot of time there, and there are exchanges between him and High, where High is kind of lamenting the loss of what he considered the good blacks who left, either prior to or after the Civil War. He laments the fact that servants just won't do anything that you tell them anymore. And Chesnutt is not afraid to take him on. And you have to remember too that Chesnutt is in his late teens, early 20s as he's doing this. This prominent white citizen in Fayetteville. And it's really High who encourages Chesnutt, if you don't like it here, you may have to just leave. If you don't like the way the South is, you may have to go somewhere else, go north. And of course, ultimately, that's what Chesnutt ends up doing is leaving Fayetteville, which at the time was a much different place than it is now. Certainly, Fort Bragg did not exist yet. It was after the Civil War, during and toward the end of Reconstruction. It's a much quieter place at that time. But he wanders all over the city. And of course, Dr. Curry mentioned his involvement with the Howard School, which was so instrumental to his education, both as a student and then later as an administrator in his early 20s. But there were also the challenges of figuring out, if you've read The House Behind the Cedars, which is set in Patesville, which is a very thinly veiled stand-in for Fayetteville, the house behind the cedars, the house itself, the titular home, is based on where Chesnutt lived for a time when he was in Fayetteville. And I became, unfortunately, obsessed with finding the original location, if possible, of this house. And I'm fairly certain that I did. You can never be absolutely sure. And there's a whole lot of rationale if you go to the tour on why I think I found it, looking at deeds and all of these other things. But most likely would have been on C Street in Fayetteville, right near the intersection with Russell Street. There's nothing there right now. It's vacant. They're vacant lots. This is looking west from C Street at the boundary line between two different properties, but most likely that's where it was. But if you want to dig into the nuance and the rationale there, you're more than welcome to do so. But what struck me most about Chesnutt's journals was how lonely he was in Fayetteville. He hardly talked. He doesn't talk at all about his family, really, his father or anyone else. And even after he's married, he mentions his wife and children sometimes, but most of the time it's this loneliness for someone who can share the confusion and the pain that he's feeling as someone who does not, as Dr. Curry says, does not fit in either world, especially in the post-Civil War South. And the closest he comes in Fayetteville, actually, to really finding someone he can relate to is someone he takes German lessons from at Clarendon House, which was a more or less a hotel that stood where the Fascinate You Museum is now. And it was a young man named Emil Neufeld, who was a Jewish German immigrant to Fayetteville. And he took on Chesnutt as a pupil because if you've studied Chesnutt, you know that he was obsessed with improving himself through learning, that he taught himself languages. And so he wanted to take lessons from Neufeld. And the mayor of Fayetteville at the time even tried to discourage Neufeld from taking Chesnutt on, saying, you're going to lose pupils, you're going to lose income. But Neufeld refused. He said that it didn't matter to him. And it's interesting because Chesnutt says that the people here, some of them at any rate, are prejudiced to Neufeld because he's a foreigner and a Jew. He says that they are so much prejudiced that he would like to hurt them real bad once. I wish he would. Some of these purse-proud aristocrats seem to think they own the whole world. And he says, kind of an ending there, this brief acquaintance, a fellow feeling makes us wondrous kind. And that's the closest he seems to come in Fayetteville to having a real connection with someone who can understand his frustrations and his loneliness, which I don't think he ever was really able to resolve, no matter how successful he was, how prominent he became later on in life. But it all starts here in our fair city. And you're welcome. I'll post the link to this tour in the chat if you'd like to look at it a little bit more. But I'll pass that on back to Dr. Tabor.
Thank you, Professor James. And yes, please do share the link